Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a sledgehammer to a myth that has literally been the bedrock of classical economics for decades. It's the story of how you, me, and everyone else actually makes decisions. And spoiler alert, we are nowhere near as logical as the textbooks thought we were. I want you to be completely honest with yourself for a second. Are you a perfectly rational decision maker? Like, do you sit there and crunch the exact mathematical odds before you make a choice? Do you constantly weigh every possible outcome to maximize your total lifetime wealth, never once swayed by emotions or how something is phrased? Well, if you're nodding your head yes right now, the science we're diving into today might just prove you completely wrong. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the rational human myth. To really get how our brains work, we first got to look at how experts used to think we worked. For a huge chunk of the 20th century, classical economists built all their models around this hypothetical being called Homo economicus. Sounds fancy, right? But it's basically this robotic, perfectly rational consumer who is always striving for the highest possible utility. And the biggest thing about this agent, they make perfectly consistent choices. If option A is mathematically better than option B, Homo economicus chooses A. Every single time, no exceptions. Classical economists mapped this all out on this beautifully smooth concave curve you see right here. It's all about risk aversion. As the money on the bottom axis goes up, the utility, or, your happiness on the vertical axis also goes up, but it kind of flattens out over time. And hey, it makes logical sense. Your first $10,000 brings way more life-changing happiness than adding 10 grand to a billion-dollar fortune, right? The classical view just assumed we all calculated this risk and value predictably and consistently. Which brings us to Section 2, breaking the rules. Here is the massive plot twist. Real flesh and blood humans systematically violate those neat little mathematical rules. Actually, let's do a super quick experiment to prove it. I want you to estimate the answer to the first math sequence in 5 seconds. Just guess. 8 multiplying all the way down to 1. Got a number? Okay, now estimate the second one, 1 multiplying all the way up to 8. When researchers gave that first sequence to people, the median guess was 2,250. But for the sequence starting with 1, the median guess plummeted to just 512. The actual mathematical answer for both? 40,320. Because we don't have time to calculate it, our brains just grab onto the first few numbers as an anchor and make a totally insufficient adjustment. Let's level this up with a super famous example called the Asian disease scenario. Imagine a terrible outbreak is expected to kill 600 people. You are the policymaker, and you have to choose between 2 programs. Program A, 200 people are saved for sure. Program B, a 1/3 chance that all 600 are saved and a 2/3 chance that no one is saved. When presented with this, 72% of people naturally choose Program A. We really like the safe bets to lock in a guaranteed gain. We are, by nature, risk-averse. But watch what happens when we literally just change the wording. Same exact disease, exact same mathematical outcomes. Program C, 400 people will die. Program D, a 1/3 chance nobody dies, and a 2/3 chance 600 die. Look closely. Mathematically, 400 dying out of 600 means exactly 200 are saved. It is the exact same choice. But faced with the sure loss of 400 lives, a whopping 78% of people suddenly switch sides to the risky gamble of Program D. When it's framed as a loss, we panic and suddenly become risk-seeking. Homo economicus would never, ever fall for this, but we do, all the time. So how do we explain this? Section 3, enter prospect theory. This is where 2 absolute legends, psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, stepped in. They realized economics needed a totally new paradigm, which, by the way, won them a Nobel Prize in 2002. Contrast that smooth, rational, classical curve we looked at earlier with this jarring, asymmetric S-curve. Notice the little cross right in the middle? That is absolutely crucial. That's our reference point. See, we don't judge our absolute wealth. We judge everything as a gain or loss from where we currently stand. In the top right, the domain of gains, the curve is concave. We're super cautious and risk-averse with our profits. But look at the bottom left, the domain of losses. The curve just plunges sharply. We are so desperate to avoid losses that we become incredibly risk-seeking when we're backed into a corner. Let's dig into why this happens. Section 4, mental shortcuts and framing. Before we even get to evaluating options on that S-curve, our brains are frantically trying to filter a very complex world. Prospect theory calls this the editing phase. Basically, we rely on 3 major shortcuts, or heuristics: First up is representativeness. This is judging probabilities by how much something matches our stereotypes, often completely ignoring real statistical sample sizes. Second is availability. We judge how likely an event is by how quickly an example pops into our head. It's exactly why people are terrified of plane crashes but don't think twice about driving on the highway. And third, adjustment and anchoring, where we stick way too closely to initial numbers, just like we did with that rapid-fire math problem. These shortcuts? Great for surviving in the wild, but they lead to huge, systematic errors in modern decision-making. If you take nothing else away from this explainer, remember this quote. People perceive outcomes not as absolute assets, but rather code them as gains and losses, defined relative to some neutral point. Think about that for a second. If you find a crisp $100 bill on the sidewalk, it feels like a massive win. You're thrilled. But if you lose $100 from $1 million investment portfolio, it feels like a stinging, frustrating loss. Your absolute total wealth is basically identical in both scenarios, but we just don't calculate our total net worth when deciding how to feel. We only care about that immediate shift from our current present-day reference point. And that leads us perfectly into Section 5, the pain of losing. This is probably the crown jewel of prospect theory, loss aversion. And it's perfectly captured by this multiplier right here, 2.2x. I want you to burn this number into your brain. Kahneman and Tversky calculated that the psychological agony of losing something is vastly more intense than the joy of gaining that exact same thing. In fact, you literally need to win about $220 just to get your emotional state back to a neutral baseline after a $100 loss. Losses loom much, much larger than gains in the human mind. And it gets even wilder when we start looking at probabilities. See that straight, perfectly diagonal line? That is how our robotic friend Homo economicus views odds. A 5% chance is treated exactly like a 5% chance. But that curved, wobbly line, that's us. Notice how the curve shoots way up on the far left side? We wildly overestimate tiny probabilities. To our brains, the jump from 0% to 1% feels absolutely massive. This perfectly explains what used to be a huge mystery. Why do people simultaneously buy insurance against highly unlikely disasters and buy lottery tickets for highly unlikely windfalls? We simply cannot process extreme probabilities rationally. All right, let's bring it all back to reality. Section 6, Marketing and Everyday Choices. Now you might be thinking, okay, this is just about gambling or crazy hypothetical disease policies. No way. Marketers exploit these exact psychological quirks every single day. Let's look at 3 ways. First, reference dependence. Marketers intentionally shift your benchmark. An item isn't just $50. It is explicitly framed as was 100, now 50. They do that to create an artificial gain in your brain rather than you feeling the $50 loss of your cash. Second, loss aversion. Those 30-day free trials, they let you adopt a product as your new status quo. So when it comes time to cancel, it feels like a painful loss to give it up. And third, diminishing sensitivity. Remember how the curve flattens out? Because of that, adding a $50 accessory to a $20,000 car purchase feels totally painless. It's just swallowed up in the flat part of the curve. Try selling that same $50 item completely on its own, and it's a much harder sell. So the next time you're wandering the aisles at the store or tossing things into your online shopping cart, I really want you to ponder this. Are your daily purchases truly your own rational, calculated choice? Or are you, just like the rest of us, the highly predictable result of mental shortcuts, cleverly manipulated reference points, and a really deep-seated aversion to losing? Once you understand the S-curve of prospect theory, I promise you are going to start seeing it everywhere. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning your choices, and we'll catch you on the next one.